Right now, behind your closed eyelids, there is a heavy, vibrating buzz that refuses to settle into the dark. It feels as though a complex cognitive machine is running at maximum power inside an empty room, its wheels spinning frantically as it attempts to analyze, diagnose, and find a perfectly logical solution to an emotional ache that does not even have a name. You are lying in bed, but your intellect is wide awake, working in overdrive, trying to decode your own exhaustion, passing through your interactions, and attempting to think your way out of a feeling. There is a profound tiredness that comes from treating your own heart like a puzzle that must be solved before you are permitted to sleep. If you are caught in this relentless cycle tonight, please know that you are not broken, and what you are experiencing is not a failure of your willpower. Tonight, we will not force your hyperactive mind to be instantly silent, nor will we demand that you solve the mystery of your anxieties instead. We are going to explore how to step away from the machine entirely. Maybe you have felt this too, during those long midnight hours when a raw vulnerability arises in your chest, and your intellect immediately treats it as an emergency that requires an intellectual explanation. We live under the constant illusion that, if we can just understand our pain completely, if we can find the perfect psychological category for our discomfort, we will finally be safe enough to find rest. We turn our inner life into an endless research project, stirring our thoughts over and over, trying to separate the light from the dark. But the surprising insight of Buddhist wisdom reminds us of a deep paradox. Overthinking is not proof that you are wise, it is simply fear pretending to protect you. The mind cannot become clear by churning its own waters, and trying to rationalize an emotional wound is like stirring a deep stone well filled with thick pine soot ink. The frantic movement does not clear the liquid, it only thickens the fluid and prevents the surface from reflecting the light of the moon. Right now, you do not need to force anything to change, and you do not have to solve your whole life tonight, dear friend. Take a slow breath in, noticing the cool air passing over the back of your throat, and let it go without forcing it into a rigid pattern. You are safe enough to soften right where you are, allowing your analytical defenses to loosen their grip on your evening. Let your awareness drift away from the complex equations of your worries and settle into the immediate physical environment of your room. Notice the faint, cool draft that glides across the bare floorboards, a quiet contrast to the dark stillness wrapped around your shoulders. The air carries a unique, grounding crispness tonight, faintly smelling of dried cedar, cold stone, and the clean stillness of an autumn night that asks nothing from your intellect. Your body is resting heavily, its shape supported fully by the mattress, requiring no answers from you, no calculations for tomorrow, and no analytical summaries of your worth. For a long time, you may have used your intelligence as a shield, believing that if you could anticipate every disaster and dissect every emotion, nothing could ever hurt you again. We become like frantic archivists, turning the quiet space of our skull into a crowded chamber where we constantly shuffle through old records, trying to find the exact reason why we feel insecure or unhappy. This mental proliferation, which the ancient teachings describe as a spinning wheel of concepts, turns every simple emotion into a labyrinth of 1,000 questions. If a sudden sadness visits us, we do not simply feel the sadness, we immediately demand to know why it is here, how long it will stay, and what mistake we made to invite it. This secondary agitation is what truly drains our vitality, turning a passing cloud of human emotion into a permanent, dense fog that traps our awareness in the dark. If it feels right, let your chest expand naturally with your next breath, and as you let the air escape, imagine setting down the heavy wooden paddle you have been using to stir your thoughts. Nothing is required of you. Now there is no problem to decode before morning, and no psychological equation to balance. When we stop demanding that our feelings present a logical explanation, a beautiful, unmapped stillness begins to open within our consciousness. We stop trying to fix our overthinking with more thinking, and we become the quiet, unhurried space that observes the thoughts without becoming them. You do not have to earn your right to rest. By solving the puzzle of your life, your body is allowed to sleep, even while the questions remain completely unanswered. In a moment, this cinematic journey will take us deep into a hidden valley, down into a subterranean manuscript cellar, where a young scribe learned the futility of fighting his own mind. But before we travel there, let yourself rest in the simple recognition of your own breathing. The inhalation is a cool, silent current entering an empty vessel. The exhalation is a heavy, dark wave returning to the earth. You are not required to monitor this breath, nor do you need to evaluate its depth. Like water finding its own level in an old well, your awareness knows exactly how to settle when the constant agitation of your analysis is allowed to pause. As you lie here, letting the slow pacing of my voice guide your nervous system into a heavier rhythm, imagine yourself walking along a quiet path made of dark, wet cobblestones. The path descends gently into a deep, protected mountain hollow where an ancient grove of cedar trees stands in absolute silence under the night sky. The air in this valley is thick, cool and damp, carrying the acrid, comforting scent of charred pine wood and the rich smell of old earth. There are no mirrors here to reflect your performance, no books asking for your critique, and no voices demanding that you explain your direction. There is only the low, ambient hum of the mountain itself, a vast reservoir of stillness that absorbs the frantic energy of your day. As you walk deeper into the grove, the heavy, academic arguments that filled your afternoon begin to lose their sharpness, softening into the dense, foggy atmosphere of the trees. Every step away from the world of analysis is a return to the direct experience of your own skin. The low branches of the cedars hang over the path like heavy, dark garments, catching the silver dampness of the night, muffling all the distant noises of human ambition. You are moving toward a place where words are no longer used to cage the truth, a sanctuary where the mind is permitted to lay down its books and rest its eyes in the darkness. At the base of a great limestone cliff, tucked beneath the roots of the largest cedar tree, a set of worn stone steps leads downward into a subterranean manuscript cellar. The air here is ancient, cool, and perfectly still. Fermented animal glue, old parchment, and the deep, silent cold of stone that has never seen the sun. It is a space dedicated entirely to preservation, illuminated only by the steady, motionless glow of two large tallow candles resting on a heavy oak table. It is here, far below the busy judgments of the surface world, that we find a quiet harbor for your intellectual exhaustion. You are invited to sit down on a low, smooth granite bench in the corner of this cellar, wrapped in a thick, unadorned robe of dark cotton that feels heavy and reassuring against your frame. You do not need to read the scrolls that line the walls, and you do not need to understand the symbols carved into the ceiling. You are simply a silent awareness, resting in the candle glow, listening to the absolute, unhurried peace of a world that has completely stopped trying to explain itself. The profound silence of the manuscript cellar holds its own unique density, broken only by the microscopic scratching of a tiny field mouse somewhere in the deep shadows behind the parchment racks. Down here, beneath the twisted roots of the ancient cedar grove, the cool stone walls seem to have absorbed centuries of absolute stillness, standing as an unyielding barrier against the loud, chaotic demands of the surface world. In this quiet, dim space, lit only by the slow, thick burning of the tallow candles, a long-forgotten chronicle begins to breathe a narrative that mirrors the exact, exhausting rhythm of your own midnight mind. Many years ago, within the subterranean archives of this very valley, there lived a young monastic scribe named Kenji. He was an exceptionally intelligent scholar, possessed of a brilliant intellect that could dissect the most complex philosophical texts with effortless precision. Yet, despite his sharp mind, Kenji lived with a deep, wordless sorrow in the center of his chest, an amorphous cloud of anxiety that he could never quite rationalize or define with his extensive vocabulary, because he could not find a logical label for his internal discomfort. His intellect treated the feeling as a monumental failure, an emergency that required a perfect intellectual solution before he could ever allow himself to experience a single moment of peace. His primary duty in the monastery was to copy the ancient wisdom records onto sheets of heavy hand-pressed hemp paper, utilizing a dark, rich liquid ink made from the soot of burned pine wood. But Kenji's analytical mind turned this quiet, mechanical craft into a grueling midnight battleground. Before he could write a single character, he would sit before a massive deep stone well filled with raw ink fluid, holding a heavy oak paddle with both hands. He became obsessed with the absolute purity of the liquid, convincing himself that if there was even a microscopic clump of pine soot, or a single layer of uneven density within the vat, his characters would be flawed, his mind would remain unaligned, and his internal sorrow would never be resolved. Every midnight, while the other monks slept deeply in their simple timber cells, Kenji would stand over the dark stone well, driving the heavy oak paddle deep into the ink. He would stir the fluid with a fierce, frantic energy, pushing the wood against the rough stone sides, making the dark liquid swirl in violent, churning vortexes under the dim tallow light. He told himself that if he just calculated the right speed, if he analyzed the thickness of the fluid with enough intensity, he could eventually force the dark sediment to separate perfectly, leaving a flawless, uniform liquid that would finally grant him the clarity to write his masterpiece. But the nature of the pine soot ink defied his aggressive logic. The harder he drove the oak paddle through the vat, the more the thick sediment rose from the deep bottom, blending with the animal glue and the water until the entire liquid became a dense, opaque froth, completely clouded with thousands of tiny suspended particles. His arms grew heavy and exhausted, his shoulders throbbed with a burning ache, and the acrid, smoky musk of the agitated fluid filled his throat until he could barely breathe. He had not cleared the ink. Instead, through the sheer force of his desperate analysis, he had turned a simple vessel of resting fluid into a turbulent, muddy storm that could reflect nothing but his own frantic strain. One night, as the cold mountain frost began to crystallize along the damp edges of the cellar stairs, Kenji collapsed onto his granite bench, his hands raw and blistered from gripping the heavy oak handle. He looked down into the dark stone well, seeing only a chaotic, swirling blackness that offered no answers to his analytical mind. A wave of profound despair washed over him, a realization that the more he intellectualized his internal confusion, the thicker and more unmanageable his thoughts became. It was in this exact hour of total cognitive exhaustion that a soft, dry rustle echoed from the deepest shadow of the cellar. Master Sosa, the elderly temple archivist, stepped slowly into the pale circle of candle glow. He was a man of immense quietness, his face lined with the deep, gentle wrinkles of someone who had spent 50 winters watching the ink dry without needing to count the seconds. In his right hand, he carried a simple old calligraphy tool, a long brush, with a handle of aged bamboo, its boundary hog bristles stiffened into a rough, unrefined point. Master Sosa did not speak immediately. He walked over to the edge of the massive stone well, his sandaled feet making a soft, sliding sound against the smooth granite floor. He looked down into the churning, frothing black liquid that Kenji had spent the entire night agitating. He observed the young scribe's shallow, rapid breathing, noting how the muscles in Kenji's forehead were locked into a tight, defensive knot of perpetual analysis. In a moment, this story will show us something even quieter, revealing the simple action that began to unbind Kenji's tired mind. The old archivist reached out and gently touched the heavy oak paddle that Kenji was still clutching like a weapon. He did not pull it away with force. He simply placed his old blue-veined thumb against the wood, waiting in absolute silence until the young scribe's white-knuckled fingers began to loosen their grip. Slowly, Kenji let his hands drop to his lap, his shoulders slumping forward in total defeat. "Master Sosa," Kenji whispered, his voice tight and hoarse from the smoky air, "I have failed my duties completely. I have spent every night for months trying to solve the secret of this ink, trying to stir it into a state of perfect clarity, so that I can finally begin my true writing. But the more I analyze its thickness, and the harder I drive this oak paddle through the stone, well, the more turbulent and clouded the liquid becomes. I am drowning in my own descriptions of the fluid, and I cannot find a way to make it still. Why does my mind create nothing but darkness when I am searching so desperately for the light?" Master Sosa did not offer a complex lecture, nor did he explain the chemical composition of the pine soot. Instead, he dipped the dry hog bristle brush directly in the center of the frothing, turbulent inkwell. He did not stir the liquid. He held the bamboo handle perfectly still, letting the stiff bristles absorb the dense, agitated fluid without moving a single inch. "Look closely, Kenji," Master Sosa said, his voice low and spacious, carrying the cool, unhurried weight of the subterranean stone. "You have spent your youth believing that clarity is an achievement born from your own muscular analysis. You treat your inner life like a machine that must be constantly beaten, forced, and re-engineered with your intellect. When an emotional sorrow arises in your chest, you do not allow it to sit. You immediately pick up this heavy oak paddle of your overthinking mind and drive it into the pool, demanding that the darkness explain itself." The old master lifted the brush out of the vat, letting a few thick, dark drops fall back into the frothing pool with a soft, heavy sound. Every time you lie awake at night, trying to think your way out of an anxious feeling, you are merely multiplying the agitation of the fluid. The pine soot particles are inherently heavy, Kenji. They do not need your intellect to tell them how to sink. They know the way to the bottom of the stone well because it is their natural resting place. Your oak paddle is what keeps them suspended in the light, turning a temporary sediment into a permanent cloud. Master Sosa laid the boundary brush down on the edge of the granite well, picked up the heavy oak paddle, and leaned it quietly against the distant stone wall, completely out of Kenji's reach. "Now," the old man whispered, pointing to the dark, swirling surface of the fluid, "do absolutely nothing. Stop your diagnosis. Stop. Sit here with me on this bench and let your intellect rest its hands." Kenji sat beside his teacher in the absolute damp cold of the archive cellar. For the few minutes, his mind screamed with the old defensive habit of urgency, telling him that leaving the ink alone was dangerous, that if he did not fix the liquid right now, it would spoil forever. His thoughts continued to spin like a phantom wheel, trying to calculate the density, trying to find a word to capture the silence. But because there was no paddle in his hands, and because Master Sosa sat beside him like a monument of unmoving stone, Kenji had no choice but to sit with the raw, uncomfortable weight of his own stillness. And then, as the candles flickered lower in their sockets, the ancient alchemy of non-action began to manifest within the stone well. Without the disruptive force of the wooden paddle, the violent vortexes slowly lost their momentum, smoothing out into a calm, dark surface. The thousands of tiny pine soot particles, no longer driven by the frantic analysis of the scribe, began to obey their own inherent weight. Grain by grain, speck by speck, they drifted downward through the fluid, settling softly and permanently onto the floor of the granite basin. After an hour of absolute quiet, the frothing turbulence was completely gone. The thick, dark sediment had formed a dense, stable layer at the bottom of the well, leaving a thin, perfectly transparent layer of clear, pristine water At the very top of the vessel, a liquid so still and pure that it caught the tiny, warm flame of the tallow candle, reflecting its light with absolute, unblemished fidelity. Kenji looked down into the glass-like surface, and for the first time in his life, he did not see an analytical puzzle to be solved. He saw his own face, calm, resting, and completely clear beneath the shadow of the mountain. Let the quiet weight of that still, reflective inkwell linger in your awareness, much like the cool mountain dampness that fills the spaces between the subterranean stones. The heavy oak paddle has been set down against the far wall, its rough wooden surface no longer carving violent vortexes through the dark liquid. The realization that washed over the young scribe Kenji as he sat in the absolute quiet beside Master Sosa is a direct mirror for the silent, exhausting battles we wage within our own minds during the longest hours of the midnight watch. He spent his youth believing that his intellect was a tool of rescue, that if he could only analyze the thickness of his confusion with enough intensity, he could force his internal sorrow to dissolve into total clarity. He did not see that the very tool he was using to seek peace, the frantic, rhythmic stirring of his own thoughts, was the exact mechanism keeping his inner world in a state of turbulent, murky exhaustion. Maybe you have felt this same heavy friction too, as you lie completely motionless beneath the shelter of your covers while the night air moves slowly through the room. You are resting physically, but your mind is still standing over the dark stone well of your life, holding onto a heavy wooden paddle of analysis, desperately stirring the waters of an old anxiety, a recent conversation, or an unnameable ache in your chest. We live with a brilliant, sensitive intelligence that quickly learns to treat any emotional discomfort as an absolute emergency, a structural failure that must be immediately diagnosed, categorized, and solved before we can allow ourselves to find rest. We mistake the relentless churning of our thoughts for a noble pursuit of truth, convincing ourselves that if we just think about our pain for one more hour, we will finally discover the magical combination of words that will set us free. But this understanding is not telling us to stop feeling, nor is it asking us to become cold, robotic, or indifferent to the authentic sorrows of our human journey. It is showing us something much quieter, a path of deep mental liberation that begins when we stop confusing the act of thinking with the act of healing. The intense desire to analyze your anxiety is born from a natural, beautiful longing to protect your heart. But when that longing transforms into a rigid demand that every emotion present a logical explanation, it turns your inner world into a crowded, smoky chamber. We turn our own awareness into a turbulent archive where we are constantly agitating the sediment, driving the paddle of our overthinking into a pool that simply wants to settle into its own natural depth. In the timeless lineage of Buddhist wisdom, we look at this frantic, stirring habit of the mind not as a permanent defect of your nature, but as a deep misunderstanding of how our inner elements find their balance. When we translate the ancient concepts of attachment and craving into the immediate emotional language of your evening, we are not talking about a distant philosophical theory. We are describing that sharp, defensive restriction in your forehead that whispers, "If I do not find the exact reason why I feel this way tonight, if I cannot decode this discomfort before morning, I am completely unsafe." This is the analytical mind demanding that the heavy sediment of life become instantly transparent through force, failing to see that the very act of prying into the dark liquid is what prevents the surface from reflecting the light. Slowly, as the tallow candles burn down in the drafty stillness, this ancient teaching comes closer to your own life, reaching into the private spaces where you feel most exposed. It invites you to see that the immense exhaustion you are carrying tonight was not caused solely by the emotional raw materials of your day. The true suffering grew from the way your mind has held those materials ever since the sun went down. It grows from the exhausting habit of treating a passing cloud of anxiety as a permanent equation that must be balanced. Driving the wooden paddle of your intellect into the same stone well night after night, wondering why the air behind your eyes feels so heavy, hot and clouded. In a moment, this journey will take to an even quieter territory, revealing a soft, internal practice that can help your mind finally lay down its heavy tools. But before we explore that space, let us understand the profound distinction the Buddha offered regarding the nature of our human discomfort. One of the great insights of the Buddha was that in every human life, there are always two distinct types of wounds, and our freedom depends entirely on our ability to see where the first ends and the second begins. The first wound is simply what life brings through our natural vulnerability, the sudden, unnameable sadness that visits the heart after a demanding day, the cold chill of an unexpected change, the raw grief of a loss, or the simple, unpolished exhaustion of a tired body. This is the first pain. It is like the dense, natural pine soot particles that sit at the bottom of the stone vessel. We cannot always prevent this first pain, because we cannot build a wall high enough to insulate our hearts from the changing seasons of the world. The second wound, however, is entirely what our own analytical mind adds to the original sorrow through intense resistance and cognitive overprocessing. The first pain is the uncomfortable feeling in your chest. The second pain is the hours of midnight overanalysis, where you turn that feeling into a personal failure, demanding to know why it is here, how long it will last, and what defect in your character allowed it to enter. The first pain is the heavy sediment resting in the well. The second pain is the turbulent, murky storm you create inside your own skull by driving the paddle of your overthinking through the fluid, refusing to let the liquid sit in the dark. The Buddha was not asking us to reject our emotions. He was showing us how to stop adding a second wound to the first, how to allow the raw ink of our experience to exist without turning the aftermath into a lifelong research project. True mindfulness, within this cool world of stone wells and resting brushes, is simply the spacious capacity to notice the density of your thoughts without needing to stir them with your intellect. It is the ability to lie perfectly still in the dark and watch an anxious pattern arise, recognizing its smoky, acrid quality without picking up the oak handle to fight it. When you practice this soft awareness, you realize that you are the vast, solid granite basin that holds the entire liquid, not the turbulent, floating particle that is currently swirling through the center. You see that your intellectual analysis does not solve your emotional fatigue. It only ensures that your upper mind remains permanently overheated, your eyes remain strained, and your spirit is too exhausted to experience the clean, transparent clarity that is already waiting for you beneath the agitation. Impermanence reminds us that the thoughts currently buzzing behind your eyes are not solid monuments carved into the bedrock of your identity. They are temporary, floating events passing through the sky of your awareness. They are like individual specks of soot suspended in water, held aloft only by the frantic momentum of your own analytical struggle. The moment you choose to stop agitating the pool, the moment you permit the heavy paddle to lean against the distant wall, the laws of nature take over without your intervention. The dense, confusing thoughts begin to follow their own inherent gravity, drifting slowly and naturally down toward the floor of your body, leaving the upper mind beautifully empty, cool and transparent. Right now, as you listen to the steady, unhurried rise and fall of your chest, notice if your overthinking mind is trying to turn this insight into another intellectual puzzle to decode. You might find yourself analyzing your own overthinking or judging your own forehead for being tight, adding yet another layer of agitation to the stone well. If that pattern is happening, let that judgment drop into the shadow too. Even that analysis is just the mind's old habit trying to use force to manufacture serenity. You do not need to master this wisdom perfectly tonight to be worthy of your rest. The subterranean stone cellar does not apologize for its dampness, and the unrefined ink does not pretend to be clear water. Your life is allowed to contain its heavy sediment, its unnameable sorrows, and its unanswered questions, resting fully in the quiet dark that asks for no explanations and requires no defense from your intellect. Let the cool, dark sanctuary of that underground archive cellar settle completely into the immediate perimeter of your awareness, allowing the vast stillness beneath the cedar roots to blend naturally with the shadows of your own room. The heavy oak paddle has been unclasped from your grip, and it now stands completely motionless against the distant stone wall, no longer slicing through the fluid, no longer manufacturing endless, chaotic vortexes out of your unnameable sorrows. If it feels right, let your attention travel gently away from the external details of Kenji's world and find the direct physical boundary of your own body resting here in the dark. Notice the deep, solid weight of your frame as it presses down into the surface of your bed, discovering that the mattress is perfectly capable of holding your entire history without asking you to analyze a single line, requiring no defensive calculations for tomorrow and demanding no intellectual justification for your fatigue. Take a slow, unhurried breath in, letting the cool night air move fully into the lower spaces of your chest, and as you let it go, invite the small muscles around your forehead and eyes to unclamp just a small fraction. There is absolutely no need to force a sudden state of mental blankness or to fight the buzzing energy that may still be lingering behind your brow. The very act of recognizing that your internal machine has been running at maximum speed is itself the first gentle shift toward freedom. If your skull feels hot and crowded from hours of trying to decode an emotional ache, simply permit that density to exist without treating it as a failure that you must immediately diagnose and correct. Perhaps you might tell that tired, analytical intellect that its vigilance is no longer required for the night, and that the world will continue to turn even if your questions remain completely unanswered until morning. Right now, as the silence of your room becomes wider and heavier, you might notice one specific thought, one particular unresolved question, or one ongoing anxiety that has been persistently asking for your cognitive energy. It might be a recent interaction you are trying desperately to dissect, a choice you are trying to rationalize, or a general feeling of insufficiency that your mind is trying to solve with an endless list of explanations. Instead of trying to push this thought away with frustration, and instead of picking up the wooden paddle to stir it into a long, circular debate, just allow the mental event to appear before your awareness. If it feels right, you might give this emotional pattern a soft, spacious name, whispering to yourself with an absolute patience, "Ah, there is the mind trying to stir the ink again." Naming the habit creates a soft, protective distance between the vastness of who you are and the floating sediment of your worries. You begin to discover that you are the deep, solid granite basin that holds the entire liquid of your life, and this buzzing anxiety is merely a handful of tiny pine-suit particles suspended in the water. Now, inside the safe sanctuary of your imagination, you might picture the interior of your own skull as that deep, dark stone inkwell filled with a cool, dense fluid. Look into that dark space and notice how the particles of your overthinking are currently swirling, driven only by the frantic momentum of your past analysis. Instead of trying to force those thoughts to disappear, and instead of trying to think your way to a solution, imagine gently opening the palms of your awareness and letting the heavy wooden handle of your effort drop away completely. Watch the paddle lean silently against the far wall of your consciousness, entirely out of your reach, its rough wood no longer agitating the surface, its force completely spent. As your hands lie empty and still in the dark, You can simply watch what happens to the internal fluid when the constant agitation is allowed to pause. There is no need to force the thoughts to sink, and there is no need to actively clear the water. The laws of your own spiritual gravity will handle the movement without a single ounce of your own effort. With every slow, natural exhalation of your breath, imagine those dense, heavy pine soot particles beginning to obey their own inherent weight. Grain by grain, speck by speck, the floating questions, the heavy diagnoses, and the analytical descriptions begin to drift slowly downward through the depth of your body. They are sliding gently away from the hot, tense space behind your eyes, traveling down past your throat, moving through your chest, and settling softly onto the floor of your abdomen, forming a dense, stable layer of quiet sediment at the very base of your being. As the particles drift downward, a profound, cooling sensation begins to spread across your forehead and temple blocks. Without the constant friction of the wooden paddle, the turbulent vortexes behind your eyes slowly lose their momentum, smoothing out into a calm, glass-like surface that requires no management from your intellect. The upper mind becomes beautifully empty, transparent and still, like a thin layer of pristine water resting at the top of the stone vessel, reflecting nothing but the quiet, unmoving darkness of the room. The thoughts are not destroyed, and the questions have not been magically erased. They have simply found their natural resting place at the bottom of the well, leaving the surface of your awareness completely unclouded, spacious, and free of strain. In a moment, this internal stillness will guide us higher up the mountain peaks, showing us how Kenji discovered an even deeper transformation within a cracked granite basin trapped in the winter ice. But for now, there is absolutely nothing for you to calculate, and nothing for you to achieve. You can imagine the inhalation as a cool, clean current of water entering the top of the well, expanding the transparency of your mind, and the exhalation as a heavy, dark wave carrying the remaining tension down into the earth. There is no judge standing over your bed evaluating the depth of your meditation, and no spreadsheet keeping track of how quickly your thoughts are settling. You are permitted to let the pool sit in the dark exactly as it is, allowing the liquid to be deep, opaque, and silent. Take another slow, unhurried breath, letting your chest rise and fall with its own natural, primitive rhythm. If your overthinking mind tries to slip back down into the depths of the vat, if it attempts to pick up the wooden paddle again, because the quiet space feels unfamiliar or unprotected, meet that movement with an immense, non-judgmental softness. The analytical intellect has been trained for many years to believe that its constant churning is the only thing keeping you safe from disaster, and it takes time for the body to learn how to rest without a problem to solve. Whenever you notice your thoughts trying to resume the diagnosis, you do not need to blame yourself for the relapse. Simply notice the fear that triggers the habit. Thank your intellect for its clumsy attempt to guard your heart. And then, whenever you are ready, return your awareness to the heavy, comforting sensation of your limbs sinking into the mattress. Nothing is required of you now. You are completely hidden from the world of measures and descriptions. A simple human consciousness breathing in a quiet room, allowed to be as unpolished, as unwritten, and as empty as an uninked sheet of parchment. The complex equations of your daily life can sit undisturbed on the table outside your door, and the tomorrow you are trying so hard to anticipate can wait in the valley below the cedar grove. You are safe enough to let the machine run out of power, safe enough to leave the sediment at the bottom of the well, and fully permitted to soften into the dark space that has never needed an answer to be perfectly whole. The deep coolness that followed the setting down of the oak paddle remained within Kenji's chest as he climbed much higher into the steep northern peaks of the valley the following morning. The sheltered cedar grove and the underground manuscript archives gradually fell away, replaced by raw, unforgiving crags of black slate, where the mountain wind blew with a continuous, thin whistle through the high gaps. Although his hands had stopped their frantic, muscular churning of the inkwell, his internal world was still caught in a subtle, defensive tremor. The old habit of his intellect was searching for a more advanced puzzle to solve, whispering that unless he could perfectly explain the origin of his inner sorrow, the clarity he had experienced in the cellar was merely a temporary illusion. He was traveling toward the source of the black pigment itself, seeking a deeper answer from the one person who understood the birth of the dark liquid. At the very throat of a freezing glacial stream, where the running water formed thick, green shelves of ice against the boulders, stood a small, low-walled hut built of rough granite slabs. This was the soot-grinding shed of Mother Omi, the elderly ink-maker whose hands provided the raw material for all the scribes of the province. The air up here was exceptionally sharp, smelling of intense frost, wet stone, and the deep, heavy musk of charred pine roots that had been smothered in earthen kilns for weeks until they turned to pure carbon. When Kenji pushed open the low wooden door of the shed, there were no books to read and no scrolls to study. The entire interior was lined with a fine, velvety layer of black dust that absorbed the dim light, making the room feel like the inside of a closed eye. Mother Omi sat on a low, three-legged stool next to a wide, shallow settling basin carved out of a single piece of cracked granite. Her hair was white like the mountain snow, her fingers permanently blackened down to the knuckles from decades of working with the carbon dust. She held a heavy, rounded granite pestle, moving it in a slow, rhythmic circle across the bottom of the basin, grinding the coarse pine soot together with fermented hide glue and mountain water. The sound was a low, scraping murmur, a continuous shush-shush that seemed to match the ancient, unhurried breath of the mountain itself. Kenji sat quietly on the dirt floor, his knees drawn up inside his heavy cotton robe, watching the dark, glistening paste move beneath her stone tool. But the deeper lesson had not yet revealed itself, and as the afternoon light began to fade into a cold purple dusk, Kenji felt a familiar, sharp constriction tightening behind his eyes. His analytical mind could not remain still in the presence of the dark fluid. He looked at the deep cracks running along the side of the granite basin, and then at the uneven, dense clusters of soot that had not yet dissolved into the water. He leaned forward, his voice carrying that familiar, tense urgency that had kept him awake for so many midnights. "Mother Omi," he said, his words breaking the rhythmic scraping of the stone, "how can you trust this ink when the basin is so deeply cracked? And look at how thick and dark the mixture is right now. If the temperature drops further tonight, this entire liquid will freeze solid before it is refined. Why do you not build a fire beneath the stone, or use a paddle to keep the fluid moving so the frost cannot lock it into permanent confusion?" The old inkmaker did not stop her hand. She allowed the heavy pestle to complete 3 more slow, grinding circles before she finally rested the stone tool against the lip of the basin. She looked at the young scholar, her eyes wide, calm, and completely unbothered by his panic, carrying the immense patience of someone who had watched 50 winters freeze the high streams. In a moment, this story will show us something even quieter, revealing the subtle transformation that began to reshape Kenji's relationship with his own heavy thoughts. She did not defend her methods, and she did not give him a complex definition of her craft. Instead, she reached out with her blackened hand and placed it gently over Kenji's tensed forehead, her rough skin feeling cold, dry, and immensely grounded against his skin. "Take a slow, cold breath, young scholar," she whispered, her voice like the scraping of slate. "You are still trying to think your way through the winter. You have learned how to set down the paddle when the water is warm, but now that the air is turning freezing, your intellect is terrified of the coldness inside your own breast. You believe that if your mind becomes still, it will freeze into a dead, useless block of ice. Mother Omid stood up, her old joints popping in the quiet shed, and led Kenji toward the open window, where several smaller granite bowls were resting on the stone sill, fully exposed to the bitter night air. These bowls contained the ink she had ground the previous day. Kenji looked down into them and saw that the liquid had indeed frozen completely solid under the mountain frost. The surface was hard, glassy, and black like polished obsidian, locked in place by the absolute power of the cold. Your overthinking mind treats your inner sorrow like an enemy that must be kept warm and moving through endless discussion, Mother Omi said, pointing to the frozen surface. You believe that if you stop analyzing your grief, the darkness will become permanent. But watch what happens when the winter is allowed to do its work without your interference. She took a small iron mallet and struck the side of one frozen bowl with a gentle, precise tap. The block of solid black ice slid out of the granite container, resting flat on her dark palm. She turned the block over, showing Kenji the hidden underside that had been resting against the bottom of the bowl. Kenji leaned closer under the dim glow of the tallow candle, and a soft gasp escaped his lips. The freezing process had not locked the ink into a chaotic, muddy mess. Because the fluid had been left entirely unattended in the absolute stillness of the frost, the extreme cold had forced a miraculous separation. The heavy, coarse particles of pine soot had been pushed naturally into a dense, solid, perfectly refined crystalline layer at the very base of the block, hardening into a glossy mass of pure carbon that was smooth like silk. Meanwhile, the extra water had risen to the top, freezing into a sheet of crystal-clear, transparent ice that was entirely free of sediment. The winter had refined the ink far better than any human paddle could have ever achieved, not by keeping it moving, but by letting it freeze into absolute non-action. The old inkmaker placed the frozen block back onto the stone sill. When the ink dries in the spring, Kenji, we shave away that clear ice from the top, and we are left with the finest, most luminous inkstone in the world, the kind that can write lines that never fade across 1,000 years. This clarity did not happen because I fought the frost, or because I tried to warm the basin with an artificial fire. It happened because I trusted the coldness to settle itself. Yuto looked at the block of frozen ink, and then at his own trembling hands, and in that exact hour a subtle, real transformation began to unfold within his chest. For the first time in his journey, he did not ask why the ink froze, and he did not try to find a psychological explanation for the coldness that was currently resting behind his own eyes. He saw that his chronic need to analyze his emotional discomfort was simply a fear of his own inner winter, a panic that if he allowed himself to feel cold, lonely or sad without a logical explanation, he would remain frozen forever. He took a long, slow breath of the freezing mountain air, choosing to do something completely new. He stopped treating his sadness as a problem to be solved. He sat down on the dirt floor of the shed, allowing his shoulders to curve, allowing the absolute coldness of the room to wrap around his frame without any resistance. He did not become magically perfect or instantly happy. The sorrow was still there, heavy and dark like the pine soot, but his relationship with the sorrow had fundamentally changed. He stopped the habit of treating every anxious thought as an absolute truth that required a defense, choosing instead to sit with the uncertainty of the evening, letting his mind freeze into a deep, dignified stillness, trusting that the density of his own heart knew exactly how to refine itself in the dark. The profound, freezing quiet of Mother Omi's soot-grinding shed lingers in the air like the scent of cold stone. After a midnight blizzard has passed over the high crags, the heavy granite pestle has stopped its circular scraping, and the cracked basin sits completely still in the shadows, allowing the black mixture to harden into its own perfect, unforced separation under the night sky. The realization that washed over Kenji as he held that block of frozen ink, is a direct pathway into the most hidden chambers of our own midnight anxiety. He saw that the very thing he feared, the absolute stillness of the winter, the cold, unmoving silence that he tried so hard to warm with the artificial fires of his intellect, was the only force capable of refining his clouded mind. The ink did not find its clarity because it was endlessly stirred by a wooden paddle. It became pure because it was finally permitted to settle into its own quiet density, allowing the heavy sediment to drop to the dark bottom. Slowly, this deep understanding begins to leave the high mountain slopes, traveling down through the frozen pine trees and entering the quiet, safe perimeter of your own bedroom tonight. When we look beneath the surface of our overthinking, we begin to decode the hidden, intricate mechanism that keeps the mind running like an engine in an empty room at 2 in the morning. For so many of us, the relentless habit of self-judgment, analytical analysis, and cognitive overprocessing is not a random defect of character. It is a deeply ingrained strategy for control. When a raw emotional discomfort arises in your chest, your intellect immediately treats it as a structural failure, an emergency that must be solved, decoded, or rationalized before you are allowed to close your eyes. We use intellectualization as a shield, believing that if we can find the perfect explanation for our unhappiness, we will finally be safe. This constant trial inside the skull is a desperate, exhausted flight from the radical uncertainty of our human experience. We are terrified of sitting with a feeling that possesses no logical vocabulary, and so we translate our raw, vulnerable grief into an endless intellectual puzzle. We replay old conversations, rehearse future disasters, and look for reassurance from our memories, trying to find the exact historical equation that will balance the ledger of our present anxiety. We even try to fix ourselves through shame, believing that if we judge our thoughts with enough severity, we can somehow force the liquid of our life to become clear. But this psychological mechanism is an illusion. Trying to solve an emotional wound with more thinking is like driving a heavy oak paddle through a dark stone inkwell. The frantic movement does not separate the fluid. It only ensures that the sediment remains suspended in the light, turning a passing shadow into a permanent cloud. One of the great liberating insights of the Buddha was that in every human journey, we are routinely touched by 2 entirely different types of pain, and our ultimate freedom depends on our ability to see where the first ends and the second begins. The first pain is simply what life brings through our inherent vulnerability as changing creatures in a changing world, the sudden chill of a loss, the unnameable sadness that visits the heart after a draining afternoon, the raw exhaustion of a tired nervous system, or the cold weight of an unexpected ending. This is the first pain. It is like the natural pilute particles that sit at the bottom of the granite basin. We cannot always control this first pain because we cannot live with flawless, infinite clarity every second of our lives, nor can we stop the winter from arriving on our doorstep. The true source of your midnight exhaustion tonight, however, is the second pain. The second pain is entirely what your own overthinking mind adds to the original sorrow through intense resistance, self-punishment, and cognitive proliferation. The first pain is the uncomfortable feeling in your stomach. The second pain is the hours of agonizing analysis, where you turn that feeling into a personal failure, demanding to know why it is here, what mistake you made to invite it, and how you can eliminate it before morning. The first pain is the heavy sediment resting in the dark well. The second pain is the turbulent, murky storm you create inside your own head by refusing to let the liquid sit in the stillness of the room. We cannot always stop the first pain from touching our skin, but we can completely choose to stop feeding the second. In a moment, this wisdom will come even closer to your daily routine, showing us how to recognize these 2 distinct pains during the busy hours of your afternoons. But before we take that step, Let yourself discover the immense, life-changing truth that peace is never described in the Buddhist tradition as the absolute absence of difficulty. Peace is not a magical state, where your life becomes an unblemished sheet of silk, or where your mind never experiences another dark thought. True peace is simply an entirely different relationship with your difficulties. It is the capacity to lie perfectly still in the dark and notice the heavy, smoky presence of an old anxiety without picking up the wooden paddle of your intellect to fight it. It is the willingness to let your inner liquid be thick, cold, and opaque for an evening, trusting that the density of your own awareness knows exactly how to refine itself without your anxious management. When you stop treating your emotional discomfort as a crime that must be investigated, the tight restriction in your forehead begins to yield to a vast, cool spaciousness. You realize that you do not need to feel perfectly happy or completely healed to be permitted to sleep tonight. The cracked granite basin does not hide its flaws, and the dark carbon dust does not apologize for its lack of transparency. Your spirit is allowed to contain its unanswered questions, its heavy sediment, and its unresolved mysteries, resting fully in the quiet darkness that requires no descriptions, demands no explanations, and asks for no defense from your intellect. Now, let this ancient alchemy of the frozen basin travel all the way down from the quiet slate-covered peaks, directly into the unpolished, rushed realities of your modern afternoons. The exhausting habit of treating every internal shadow as a crisis does not just happen in a subterranean manuscript archive or a remote soot-grinding shed. It replicates itself with a relentless, humming frequency inside the digital spaces, the crowded rooms, and domestic environments of your daily routine. We live in a world that demands a continuous, artificial transparency and expectation that our thoughts should always be perfectly organized, our progress should look smooth like polished jade, and our emotions should be completely rationalized before we share them. When your daily reality does not match this impossible standard, the analytical engine behind your eyes instantly panics, picking up the heavy wooden paddle of overthinking, frantically churning your inner pool to find an immediate solution. Think of how this pattern manifests in the small, seemingly mundane moments of a normal week. Perhaps you are sitting on the edge of your couch in the late afternoon, your face illuminated by the cold, pale glow of a phone screen, waiting with a tight restriction in your chest for a specific text message or an email response that has been delayed for hours. In those long, hollow stretches of silence, your intellect handles the absence of data exactly the way Kenji handled the raw particles in his inkwell. You treat the silence as an emergency that must be decoded. Your mind begins to stir the liquid, generating 100 theories about what the delay means, replaying your past messages, and searching for the exact error you made to cause this distance. You check the phone for reassurance every few minutes, hoping a notification will arrive to smooth out the turbulent anxiety in your stomach, failing to see that the constant checking is the very movement keeping the sediment suspended in your light. Maybe you have felt this deep fatigue during a busy workday, standing in a brightly lit corridor or sitting in a meeting while maintaining a polite, composed smile for the people around you, even though your internal climate feels completely clouded and heavy with a sadness you cannot explain. You perform your duties with meticulous care, yet underneath the surface, you are comparing your chaotic, unrefined internal mixture with the clean, effortless presentation of your peers. You look at their lives and conclude that their ink is thin, clear, and perfectly balanced, while your own journey feels clumped, fragmented, and permanently behind the milestones of the world. When you finally close your laptop and turn off the lights to rest, a subtle bitter guilt prevents you from yielding to the mattress. An internal voice whispers that you have not thought enough today, that you have not solved your dilemmas, and that you must keep paddling through the dark until you find a logical blueprint for tomorrow. And perhaps this is where the teaching begins to touch your own heart in the middle of a crowded, overwhelming afternoon. True inner stillness is not something you have to travel to a mountain cave to find, nor is it a luxury reserved for those whose lives are entirely free of complications. Peace is practiced in the micro-moments of an otherwise chaotic schedule. It is the single, deliberate breath you choose to take before clicking a link, opening an app, or answering a sharp question from someone whose approval you are craving. In that brief, unhurried space before you react, you are performing a rare act of spiritual discipline. You are allowing the wooden handle of your effort to rest. You are permitting the moment to be thick, cold, and uncertain without deciding that you must immediately activate your intellect to fix it. You can walk through your daily routine with the slow, poetic understanding that not every anxious thought that crosses your mind deserves your obedience, and not every heavy feeling is an absolute command. When the old habit of overthinking arrives, when your intellect begins to rehearse a future argument, or look for hidden threats in a partner's silence, you can learn to meet that internal buzz the same way Mother Omi met the freezing mountain frost. You can observe the cloudiness and say to yourself with an immense, soft patience, "Ah, there is the mind trying to churn the vat again." You do not need to fight the thought, and you do not need to hate your intellect for being anxious. You only need to let the particle float through your awareness without gripping it so tightly that your temples begin to throb with heat. You can care deeply about your work, your relationships, and your responsibilities without turning your own mind into a frantic archive where you are constantly interrogating your own worth. When you release the impossible demand to have a perfectly transparent, problem-free history, your relationship with your daily life begins to soften. You stop looking at your periods of confusion or grief as personal failures, recognizing instead that those very moments of coldness and non-action are what allow the heavy sediment of your experience to find its true level. They are the natural winter cycles of the heart, creating the dense, durable clarity that makes your presence real, heavy, and resilient over time. Think of how much lighter your evenings would feel if you allowed your body to rest without demanding that it earn the right to turn off the machine. Rest is not a reward you receive after you have successfully solved every puzzle on your mental checklist. It is the very ground from which your clarity is formed. It is a form of profound self-compassion to look at your unfinished projects, your unanswered messages, and your ambiguous relationships at the end of the day, and say to yourself, "The pool is dark and thick tonight, but the paddle is leaning against the wall, and the basin can sit in the dark." You can forgive yourself for the limits of your energy, knowing that you cannot build a clear tomorrow if you are constantly churning the waters of tonight. Tomorrow, when you find yourself caught in the old trap of replaying an old conversation or checking your phone for a sense of safety, take a slow, unhurried breath. Remember that your awareness is the vast, ancient stone well that can hold any amount of sediment without losing its identity. Like the frozen blocks of ink refined by the high mountain frost, your spirit becomes steady and clear not by fighting the coldness, but by letting the mixture sit in absolute stillness. You can drop the need to force an immediate outcome, allowing the fluid of your days to settle naturally, trusting that beneath every cloud of suspended thoughts, a pristine, unblemished clarity is already waiting to reflect the quiet light of the world. The high mountain winds have finally grown perfectly quiet along the dark slate crags, leaving an absolute, unhurried stillness to settle over the stone-walled shed and down into the immediate deep shadows of your own room. The heavy granite pestle has ceased its circular scraping against the stone, and the weighted oak paddle remains completely motionless against the distant wall, its rough wood no longer slicing through the fluid, no longer manufacturing endless vortexes out of your unnameable anxieties. There is no thick mixture left for your intellect to examine tonight, no past conversation you are required to decode, and no future uncertainty you must force into a logical blueprint before morning. The great winter night has wrapped your entire consciousness in a soft, heavy blanket of mountain frost, inviting you to step completely away from the crowded archives of your thoughts and return home to the simple, unquestioning sanctuary of your own breathing body. Listen closely to the slow, heavy cadence of the air as it moves through the quiet dark of your room. The inhalation rises softly within your chest like a cool, silent current entering an empty stone vessel, and the exhalation falls away without a single ounce of your own management, letting the last lingering heat of the day's analysis dissolve into the midnight air. Your breath requires no performance from your intellect tonight, no standard of excellence to meet, and no conceptual explanation of your worth. It is a natural, primitive rhythm that knows exactly how to support your frame without your constant surveillance. With every slow release of air, let your limbs sink just a fraction deeper into the clean density of your sheets, allowing the tired, vigilant muscles behind your eyes to unclamp completely and permitting your jaw to drop away from the tension of the afternoon. Let your imagination rest one final time upon that quiet, soot-grinding shed tucked into the frozen hollow of the mountain stream. The small tallow candles have burned down to a faint, warm amber glow, casting long, peaceful shadows across the smooth granite benches and the baskets of raw carbon dust. The blocks of frozen ink resting on the stone windowsill have completed their natural, unforced separation under the winter sky. The thousands of heavy, dark pine soot particles that once clouded the water have drifted completely down to the very base of the bowls, solidifying into a dense, beautifully refined crystalline layer that is smooth like polished stone, while the extra water has risen to the top, freezing into a sheet of pristine, transparent ice that reflects nothing but the quiet dark. The ink does not fight the frost, and it does not try to warm itself with an artificial fire. It simply yields absolute stillness of the evening, trusting the laws of its own gravity to reveal its hidden clarity. The fabric of your own mind is allowed to find that same dignified rest tonight. The thoughts that have been buzzing behind your eyes all through the day are not solid monuments carved into your identity. They are merely temporary particles suspended in the fluid of your awareness, held aloft only by the frantic momentum of your own analytical struggle. The moment you choose to let the wooden paddle remain against the wall, the moment you permit your hands to lie empty and open in the dark, the constant agitation begins to run out of power. Grain by grain, speck by speck, the floating questions, the heavy diagnoses, and the over-processed worries begin to drift slowly downward through the depth of your body, traveling far away from the hot, tense spaces of your forehead, moving past your chest, and settling softly onto the floor of your abdomen, leaving the upper mind beautifully cool, transparent, and empty. Take another slow, natural breath, letting your chest rise and fall with its own unhurried, primitive wisdom. There is no trial taking place in this dark room, no ledger keeping track of your unresolved dilemmas, and no requirement for you to balance the equation of your life before the sun rises. You are completely hidden from the world of measures, descriptions, and comparisons, allowed to be as unpolished, as unwritten, and as silent as an uninked sheet of parchment resting in a dark drawer. The complex problems of your daily life can sit undisturbed on the table outside your door, and the tomorrow you are trying so hard to anticipate can wait in the valley below the cedar grove. You do not have to earn your right to this stillness by solving your history. Tonight your body is allowed to sleep deeply, even while the questions remain completely unanswered. As the night deepens, Imagine that block of refined pine soot ink being placed gently inside a dark, smooth lacquer box in the center of the archive cellar. The lid is closed softly, shutting out the last flickering glow of the tallow candle, leaving the hardened ink to rest in absolute, unmoving darkness. It holds no words, it displays no symbols, and it reflects nothing but the silent, empty space around it, completely free of the need to explain its own nature. Your awareness can slide naturally into that same dark lacquer box, losing its sharp, analytical boundaries, becoming beautifully heavy, dense and still, like a solid mineral element, returning to the deep earth. The internal machine has finally run out of power. The courtrooms of your overthinking have grown entirely cold, and your spirit is safe enough to let go of the struggle completely. What if the clear, transparent water you have been trying so hard to manufacture through the frantic churning of your thoughts was already right here, quietly waiting for you to simply set down the paddle?